Welcome to AI Australia, brought to you by eliiza. On this show, your hosts James Wilson and Nigel Dalton have in-depth conversations with technology leaders, academics, and AI professionals about all things artificial intelligence. We'll explore a broad range of topics, including AI strategy, technology, and ethics, providing valuable insights for Australian businesses at all stages of AI adoption. And now, your hosts, James and Nigel.
G'day everybody, welcome back to AI Australia. Nigel, you've just run across a very humid and hot Melbourne from Pause Fest to be here today.
I am, and I'm here to say, James, that I'm deeply insulted by one of our recent guests' machines. And I know this was Niels Wouter's intent, was to offend people, but may I read you out what the marvellous biometric mirror concluded about me today. I am male, very good. I am 60 years old, according to the algorithm. That's like, come on, I'm apoplectic with that. That's terrible news. I'm an unhappy, irresponsible, ugly introvert with a high level of aggression. And so that's who you've got co-hosting your show today. What a wonderful conversations going on at Pause Fest over Niels and his team's machine. And it's living up to everything he promised us from last week's podcast.
Awesome. That's a very interesting reflection on you, Nigel. And of course, all of that is completely false.
Goodness, it's how it makes me feel. That's what's remarkable is, like, I know it's an experiment. I know the architecture and the code side of it because we spent a lot of time with Niels, and I still feel insulted. Gosh, it's tough being a human.
Did you just accept it, of course, like the younger demographic?
I'm baby boomer, my friend, and I'm arguing every inch of the way.
All right, well, great to be here, Nigel. And should we introduce our guest today?
I think that's a fine idea. We're extremely lucky to have Chris with us today, giving it away.
Yep.
Who have we got?
So welcome to the show, Chris. So Chris Hausler leads the data science team at Zendesk, and he spent the last few years building out the team, building customer-facing AI products for Zendesk. Previously held the titles data scientist, data engineer, researcher, student, consultant, programmer, and before that, student again. And through all these roles, the single continuous theme has been a deep interest in data and the stories it can tell. So Chris, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much.
Now, I'm going to open Zendesk. We all use it, let's be honest. I didn't really know there was AI or that much machine learning behind it. Get me from it being an incredibly useful ticketing system for us managing work to it being at the forefront of machine learning and AI. How did you add that onto such a great web service?
Yeah, I think it's been something that's been built up over the last couple of years. We've been building out the team, and we sort of started small with, how do we get all of our data in one place and actually see what's going on here? And I think we're incredibly lucky to sort of be the custodians of these amazing data sets of conversations between companies and their customers, right? And the result is millions and billions of these interactions where people are asking for help and support agents are giving that help. And what you find when you dig into that is that, a lot of these interactions can be quite repetitious. And so it's sort of a prime use case for being able to pick up AI and sort of like think about, okay, for these places where people are doing the same thing over and over again, how can we maybe think about either streamlining that or taking them out of the way or automating them and sort of giving people a chance to do some of the more interesting work that isn't answering the same question over and over.
And is there a bot element to that as well, and a bot automation element to tell me to turn it off and on again?
Yeah, no, there totally is. So we, I think one of the key products that we've been building out of Melbourne, our data science team is all based here. It's called AnswerBot, and the idea behind AnswerBot is that if you send in a support request, like an email or something like that, right, we can look at the email the bot can look at the email that's been sent in and sort of match it against a set of knowledge base articles that the company's already written. So, you might get questions a lot about how do I reset my password? So you write an article that says, these are the things to do to reset your password. I think the issue is often people don't go and read those articles, right? And they reach out straight away. So basically the idea behind AnswerBot is sort of allowing us to sort of get in between, return back to the person requesting support really quickly, some suggestions on articles that might help them resolve the issue, and allow that end user to sort of go really quickly, find that information and actually self-solve the ticket, which is great for them because they get the answer really straight away within seconds, as opposed to waiting for however long a support queue might take. But agents also don't have to then, go through the same sorts of questions over and over again.
So it must be fascinating because the meta picture you could paint about the hotspot megawatts of technological usage today must be incredible.
Yeah, it's super cool. I think so one of the products actually that we built on top of the tech that backs AnswerBot is called content queues, and that's super interesting, I think, because we can use that same technology, which effectively allows you to see how similar or dissimilar two documents are. And we can use that to sort of look at support tickets that come in for a particular customer and group them together and start to understand what the patterns look like. Because if you're a web scale company and you get millions of support tickets a month, it's very hard for any person to read through all of those and understand all the things that are happening. But we can go and find those patterns for you and tell you things like, there's this group of tickets over here. They're like 30% of all the things that people care about. This is what they're about. By the way, maybe you don't have a knowledge-based article to address this. Maybe you should go and write that. So it's super cool.
And you think with as voice of the customer and understanding customer sentiment at any given point in time, I mean, Zendesk probably knows more about the sentiment of the customer than the company themselves.
We probably do, and we have a product for that as well. It's called Satisfaction Prediction. It was actually the first machine learning-based product that we developed, and the idea there was exactly that. So we have a thing called a satisfaction survey. I think it's pretty common in customer service, which is, I have a support request and I have an interaction with an agent, and hopefully they resolve that request. And afterwards, we can ask the person whether they had a good or a bad support experience, and they can give that feedback. The problem is that, that comes too late, right? Like if I've already had a bad experience, well, I've had a bad experience and I'm walking away unhappy. And so the idea behind satisfaction prediction is to be able to predict like the probability that a ticket's going to end up with a good or bad response while the ticket's in flight, so that you can go and do things around it. You can set up business rules that route it to a particular crack team of people who are awesome at turning around unhappy customers. You can send them, a $10 voucher for your product or all these sorts of things, but it allows you to know sort of in advance before it happens and hopefully intervene.
And I mean, for us in Melbourne, everyone in the tech community knows Zendesk. I mean, if you work in the tech community, you've been to a meetup at Zendesk.
I can explain that, James. As you've just said, they have the best meetup culture of any company I know in Australia.
Yeah, I think on behalf of the Melbourne tech community, I think we owe Zendesk a big thank you, because you always make your incredible space available. I've attended many meetups there. There's always food. There's beers in the fridge. It's a great experience. So big thank you to the entire team at Zendesk for being so generous.
But James, they're data scientists. They're predicting what's going to come of that. I've got a feeling it might be correlated with recruitment.
Well, I'm sure it does play a big part in it, right?
It's definitely an angle, right? But I think also just sort of the idea of growing that tech community in Melbourne. I mean, part of it is we're growing really fast. We want to hire a bunch of really talented people. And the more we can interact with those people and be visible to them, the better for us. But I think as well, like the health of the broader community is what's going to sustain us in the long run. People in tech move jobs, right? They might stay with us for 2, 3, 4, 5 years, and they might see a better opportunity somewhere or something that's sort of aligned with where they want to go. But, hopefully they might leave us on really good terms, also talk to other people about how great an experience they had. Other people know they get that experience. They want to come to us. And I think building out that community amongst tech companies in Melbourne is super important.
And we all know the products and services, as I mentioned, but for people outside of the tech community, Zendesk might not be as well known a name. So, and I think you have your 10th anniversary this year, or Zendesk turns 10 years old. Is that right?
It was late last year, but yes, we've basically just turned 10.
So milestone. Can you share a bit more about the history of Zendesk and the story behind the business?
Yeah, sure. So Zendesk was founded by 3 Danes, Mikkel, Alexander, and Morten. And basically, I think the idea is that they sort of had experience working in customer support software, but back when they started this, it was very enterprise, install on-premise, and quite painful for businesses to get set up and quite inflexible, right? You might have support for email over here, but you have very different people, very different infrastructure for supporting via the phone over there. Integrating with Twitter was totally not a thing. There's all of these different steps. And so I think the really great idea they had was, can we make this simpler, easier to get started? Can we make it software as a service and maybe make it a bit fun as well? And that kind of kicked off around 10 years ago. And since then it's seen them migrate to San Francisco, which is our head office. We went IPO we went public. We listed as a company in 2014, and we've grown enormously. So I think I started there almost 5 years ago when we were 600 people internationally. We're now 2,600 people internationally and projecting to be even bigger again over the coming years. It's been a pretty exciting ride.
I can't think of any other business or tech business, certainly in Melbourne, that's headquartered in, say, San Francisco, but then runs their entire kind of data science capability here in Melbourne. Yeah. So it's a bit of a coup, I think, for Melbourne that Zendesk does that.
I think also it works both ways for us. I think if we compare ourselves to San Francisco, one of the advantages is that the hiring market here is a lot less competitive than what we see in San Francisco. So that certainly works to our favor. But I think the reason here is my boss at the time when I got hired. I think he really saw that data was going to be a big thing for us as a company, and we were hiring a data engineering team at the time, thinking about how we could stand up things like Hadoop and that sort of stuff. But as he was hiring that team, in the back of his mind, he was thinking ahead, this data science and machine learning, that these things could really play a part. So he was hiring people like myself who sort of have a bit of a mixed background and sort of knew a bit about that space as well. And that sort of led to us actually spinning out a data science team in Melbourne. And we've started building the data product here, and that's sort of just grown ever since.
James, I'm sensing a sort of data science spring here. I know you were worried recently about another data science AI winter coming on, but this week I saw the tweets from another guest of ours, Kendra, and the team at Seek saying they've replaced their search engine. They've got rid of the old search metaphor and put in that kind of more fuzzy natural language processing, able to find senior engineering jobs that are actually engineering brackets senior jobs, and I'm super excited about this, just making life easier for people.
One would hope, yeah, totally.
You touched on that, or you touched before on you've been at Zendesk for almost 5 years. You talked about your career background a little bit, and data science didn't exist when you were at uni, I'm sure.
It did not. No.
So, how's your career journey kind of played out up to this point?
Yeah, it's been interesting, definitely not planned or orchestrated. I think I did my undergrad in computer science, and I ended up doing that because I actually got kicked out of an electrical engineering degree that I wasn't particularly good at. But during that, I took a C coding course, and I was like, oh, this is kind of interesting. And, I started working as a software engineer, and I think from the very beginning, I was always interested in back-end systems. I liked SQL, and I liked being able to make reports of stuff and all those sorts of things. But after working in that space and in consulting for a while, I kind of felt like I was solving the same problem over and over again, and sort of thought, well, maybe I'll go back to uni. I'd been in Berlin on holidays previously and really liked the place. I also found out that education there was free. So I was like, okay, I'm going to move to Berlin. I'm going to do a master's. And it made the decision quite easy because at the time there was only 10 master's degrees on offer that were in English. So, that was basically how I ended up sort of going into machine learning and so forth, was that I had these 10 courses to choose from, and that sounded like the most appropriate for me. So I ended up doing a master's in computational neuroscience, which is very much thinking about data analytics, data modeling, machine learning as applied to, the brain and how the brain works, which was super interesting. I think the main thing I learned through doing that was that we understand very little about how the brain works, but it is an amazingly interesting problem. But along the way through doing that master's and then a PhD afterwards, I learned all of the things that I guess are the tools of the trade now. Programming in Python, all of the standard machine learning models, statistics, all of these things, and I sort of ended up popping out of my PhD degree at the end with having specialized in deep learning, which was kind of a nascent thing at that point, to find that was a thing that people were very excited about, and that actually worked out really well. But it definitely wasn't planned. But that's sort of how I ended up sort of getting into industry and doing this sort of stuff.
Deep learning was kind of like the unpopular part of AI at that time. It was all kind of expert systems. And
we were chatting before about computer vision and how that sort of stuff's impacted computer vision. And I think looking back now, it's pretty amazing that these people in the deep learning space were submitting papers to computer vision conferences and getting rejected because it wasn't the right way of doing it. And now you see, if you go and look in computer vision, everything is deep learning because it blows everything else out of the water. The amount of progress in the last few years has been absolutely amazing.
So Melbourne born and bred before going to Germany?
Brisbane born and bred. Yeah, until my early 20s, and a brief stint in Sweden, and then Melbourne, then Germany, then back to Melbourne.
So what was so back to Melbourne was post PhD?
Post PhD, yeah. We had a kid, decided we wanted to move somewhere warmer, and chose Melbourne for its weather, which in comparison to Berlin's weather is actually a pretty good upgrade.
Bit of a downgrade from Brisbane, isn't it?
Yeah, less humidity though, usually outside of today.
And then back to Germany again, did you say?
I was in Sweden during my undergrad for an exchange sort of thing, and then Germany in one go for 5 years, and then back, and then Melbourne.
Fantastic. And then when you look at, you talked before about talent and the talent market here in Melbourne being not as competitive as San Francisco.
Yeah.
And for those of us in Melbourne, it seems pretty competitive.
It definitely is. It definitely is.
But so you find from a supply point of view that the talent is there's good talent in the market. I mean, is it a supply challenge, or is it more of is it just a volume or a supply or skills? What are the challenges you face when you're trying to recruit here?
Yeah, I think We've always found it relatively easy to find people for the positions that we're hiring for, particularly in the data science space. I think part of that is to do with the fact that we've been lucky enough to get the backing from the company to sort of be, quite advanced in that space. And, through meetups and through giving talks and, we've sort of built a bit of a reputation around it, which helps us attract people. Definitely trying to find more senior people in the machine learning data science space in Melbourne is quite difficult. So most of the hires we've had, we've found smart people who are coming out of university who are either, have a little bit of a background in that space or are interested in learning that space, who we feel like, are well aligned with our team, and we've brought them on and we've helped skill them up, and, that's sort of how we've grown the team over time. Yeah. So I think we haven't really had a lot of trouble finding smart, talented people who are really curious and interested in doing this sort of work.
So I'm very curious about how you fit that together in an organisation. I know I get asked this question a lot. Our listeners have sent it in going, well, find out where do they have one giant team of data engineers and another team of data scientists, and they're on another floor, with back massages and grapes and all of the things being to feel well looked after, and then the techies are downstairs and they send downstairs for a data file. How on earth does a successful company like Zendesk integrate your field into? Let's face it, you've got some lines of code there.
Yeah, I think so. Luckily, I think we're all treated pretty well at Zendesk, so grapes for everyone. But yeah, it's actually a really good question, and I think we've sort of. It's something that we've changed a bit as we've evolved. We've always tried to be very closely tied with the product teams that we're working with to build product. I think we're definitely not on a different floor off doing our own thing. I think Zendesk's view, my view on this, is that we want to be able to use machine learning as a way of building better product for our customers, and that inherently means we need to be with product teams, with product managers, with engineers, with designers, all of these people. It's definitely a team sport. It's not something that a data scientist can ship by themselves, and they certainly can't ship it and scale it to 130,000 plus companies that we have now using Zendesk all by themselves. So it's very much a team sport. We're very much tightly integrated. We've bounced backwards and forwards a little bit between whether people are permanently embedded in teams, whether they're part of a data science organization and they're in teams on a project basis. And I think that's something that has changed as we've grown. I think now we're starting to think, particularly as we're looking to hire into San Francisco now and into Copenhagen as well on the data science front, how do we start supporting more locations? And we're thinking probably the right way to do this is to have centralized teams in each location who can be really tightly coupled with product teams when they're working with them, but have the flexibility to move around between product teams as well to support multiple products.
And do you find that you need that for the way that you're applying some of these technologies specific to Zendesk? Is the local, because you must have multiple languages supported. Yeah. That must be challenging from an engineering science point of view. Totally. So do you actually look to do some of the work closer to the local language market? Or
we haven't so far, because we've been built entirely out of Melbourne, and we do have a pretty international sort of workforce in Melbourne, so we've got people from all over the place. And I think the other thing is that we need to learn how to work in languages that we don't have, where we don't have people who speak it, because we, as a company, support many more languages than we're probably ever going to find data scientists who sort of are fluent in. And luckily, a bunch of the technology that we use, like the deep learning that we apply to text and so forth, is transferable, to a certain extent, so we can hone our skills, hone our models on the languages that we understand really well, and then, start trying to apply it to the other ones and use more data-driven, more metric-driven insights into how well that's working, as opposed to necessarily being able to really interpret it ourselves.
I'm curious, have you married yourself to one stack of Google tools or Amazon tools, or how do you maintain sort of operational efficiency in your knowledge base of your own people and the skill base?
It's tricky. I think that field is moving super fast. As I said, we started on Hadoop, and I think as we were building Hadoop, Spark was already a thing. And the technology is always changing. I think on the data science side, machine learning side, it's been the same. We were very early adopters of TensorFlow when it was in alpha, and that has iterated so many times, so many breaking changes, all these sorts of things. Where I think we're pretty well wedded to TensorFlow stack. I think in the machine learning space, we're definitely Jupyter Notebooks, TensorFlow, Pandas, Python, all of those sorts of things. But there's a lot of work to keep up, and keep our code bases up to date. But I don't think that's particularly different to any engineering, to be honest. Every package that you use in any language, the popular ones are always being updated. They're getting new features. Features are being deprecated, and I think that's part of good health to sort of keep up to date with that and make sure you're not falling behind.
And on the topic of skills, you mentioned before that you tend to look for really smart people out of uni and train them up. And is that because the techniques and the tools are moving so fast that there aren't really many people using them at scale in production, and therefore it makes sense to just keep people trained and find people that can learn new things quickly?
Definitely. I think the ability to learn new things quickly is super important because we're constantly trying to keep up with the latest research, and that itself is moving so fast. The tools are moving so fast. So I think, the ability to teach yourself how this stuff works is much more important than knowing really, really in depth how it was 5 years ago, because it's also to a large extent been superseded.
And I think Kendra, when Kendra Vant from Seek joined us here, and she gave a couple of really interesting insights, and she said that in her experience, a good data scientist needs at least kind of 3 or 4, I think it was three engineers to support them to be kind of productive. And she said no, she hadn't seen that ratio questioned yet. Do you think that's pretty consistent?
I'd probably lean more towards 4. Totally. Yeah, I think that's, I think that the amount of work they generate around them, particularly when you start thinking about product, like, well, how do we take this idea, this model, and actually get it in front of people, build the user interface, build the feedback loops, make it scalable, robust, all of those sorts of things. That's for us, we're not doing data science in a bubble and sort of coming up with a model and saying it's done. We very much need to get it out in front of people and validate it. And there's a really large amount of effort involved in making that happen.
And how do you approach, because I imagine a data scientist sitting with a say a product manager, then that product manager or product owner needs to have a bit of a pretty good understanding of some of these tools and techniques as well. So is that something where you've invested in helping people get familiar with those tools in Zendesk?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we're still pretty localized in where we build data product in Melbourne, and I think we've been lucky enough to grow together with some really great product managers, but it's definitely one of those things that we're thinking now, is where we want to go and work with teams who've never done this sort of stuff before. What are the skills gaps or the knowledge gaps? Like, where our expectations may be misaligned? How do we think about this stuff in the same way? Because machine learning powered product tends to be a lot more uncertain, I think, than building, like a standard web interface or something. Like, generally speaking, if you're building a feature where you click a button and a thing happens, that you can think about how that might work and sort of plan out, and there might be some really challenging technical problems, but you probably assume that you can solve them. Whereas machine learning approaches, can I find the right answer to someone's support request automatically? We would like to, but we really need to prove out that we actually can, and it's an unknown until you've done it, like any research.
I think that's such an interesting point, because it's come up a lot. I've seen this a lot as well, in that a lot of traditional capital allocation processes in large enterprises geared towards certainty of outcome. And this is, APIs or building an app or a website maybe a few years ago, you could be pretty accurate prediction mostly around what, complexity.
Yeah.
Whereas this is, to your point, science and exploration. And the outcome is not validated. And I wonder if that's why it is organisations like a Seek and a Zendesk are pioneering this, because do the business practices around project funding in large enterprises, do they almost make this type of stuff prohibitive?
Yeah, it's quite possible. I think we've definitely been very lucky that I think Zendesk has been very generous in sort of supporting us through this, because the first project we were working on, there's a whole bunch of stuff to stand up around it. It takes a long time, but we got some good traction with it, and that sort of feeds into the next one, and we've been able to slowly build momentum and win hearts and minds at the same time and change the way people think about these sort of products. But it's definitely an ongoing discussion, I think.
So in Toby Walsh's terms, you're one of the good people in terms of he has good. There's not good AI and bad AI. There's good people and bad people. And I think that's a fairly decent sort of analysis of it. But do you run into any of the sort of ethical boundaries with the knowledge that you have and the questions you can ask with what you've got?
So I think the products that we've approached so far have been relatively benign, I would say, from an ethical perspective. Like, that you can mostly just think of the good things that come out of them. But definitely, I think we would like to be moving into a space where maybe how you interact with some of our products becomes more personalized, more personal data driven. And definitely as you start to go down that path, there's a whole bunch of ethical questions you need to start asking yourself. And I think our team is very in tune with that, but it hasn't necessarily been something that has had a huge practical impact day to day so far. But I think in the future, it's definitely, with those sort of like personalization products, it's going to be very important.
Yeah, the ethics conversation comes up a lot here, and I suppose to your point, the use cases today are quite benign, and they're generally quite predictable outcomes. But
wait till Zendesk consults my generation, the baby boomers, with a dumbed down, have you tried turning it off and on again bot talking to me? Then I'll be all over it.
Yeah.
Well, I'll leap in with a question.
Sure.
So I noted, I stalked you on Twitter. I love Twitter, and I've just done my 10 years on Twitter. So I've had my 10th anniversary. You've been on there longer. You've been on there since 2007.
I think I was just namespace grabbing. I've never been a super active user, but I was like, well, maybe one day I want this. I should get my name.
But nice work, because in there you retweeted something that blew my mind, and it's a tweet about the improvement in image recognition. And it's got a photograph, and it's pixelated and tiny in the first one. And then I think it's across from 2014 to maybe 2017 or 18. And the end result of that is incredible. Now, it references general adversarial networks, and I'm going to confess I don't really know what those are. But I'm intrigued by this sensational change in capability. GANs for 101, I'd love, could you explain that for me? And then what's going on with that photographic project?
Yeah, so I think at a really high level, GANs are two competing neural networks. And so the idea is that there is one generative neural network that is really interested in trying to be able to, its job is it wants to generate a good photo of someone, right? And then we have a discriminator network, and its job is to try and work out whether the photo that's been generated is a real photo or a fake photo. And they basically fight it out, right? And so, I think like on a deeper technical level, there's some backwards and forwards. So the things that you learn from the discriminator, like the gradients within that network, can then be fed into the generative network so that you can update the parameters in there, and it's going to do a better generation. But at the crux of it, they're basically fighting it out, and the generator wants to fool the discriminator, and the discriminator wants to be better at discriminating between fake images and real images.
So it's robotic pair programming.
Yeah, it's basically robotic pair programming. It's pretty amazing. I think like one of the really interesting thing about that is it's a way of almost generating new training data all the time, right? You don't need to know much about the images that you're trying to generate. You just need to know that I have a whole bank of real images. And now I'm just going to keep trying to discriminate between these real images and the generated ones, and you can just go on doing that forever.
So that series of images from a highly pixelated, low-resolution one to an image that I cannot tell whether that's a photograph of a human or something computer-generated.
Yeah.
What's been the technologies behind the acceleration in the last 4 years?
I think I think if you go into the literature, there's a huge amount of tweaks involved in how they've managed to stabilize the learning of these networks over time. How do they generate better loss functions, which is basically the things that the networks are trying to optimize for, how they generate better data for it, and compute power is also definitely a part of it. And I think like the community as a whole it's been a really interesting space for the last couple of years. So there's been a lot of people rallying around that space and sort of feeding off each other's invention, if you will. And it's definitely, it's gone from the point where you could generate like an image that's maybe 28 by 28 pixels to things that are megapixel size now, and super convincing. And if you go and jump on YouTube, you can find many really interesting and just like amazing generations of images. And I think one of the really interesting things that you can do in this space as well is once you say built a model that you can generate images of faces or something like that, you can think about how you can morph from one type of face to another. Like, for example, you could give the example of your face and my face, right? And you can imagine there's some sort of continuum of faces, of changes, small changes you need to make to a face between my face and your face. And you can ask a GAN to do the generation in between and do this like slow morph between one person and another person.
The dystopian science fiction people would be starting worrying just about this point right now in this podcast.
Well, and this has been interesting with some of the deep fakes that we've seen on the news recently. And I know that the one that came out, I think a couple of weeks ago, was a combination of Jennifer Lawrence and Steve Buscemi, the actor.
Yeah, I saw that.
And
creepy.
It was really quite creepy.
Is this how deep fakes are done?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
And I've seen the one that I think there's a Chinese company in Kai-Fu Lee's book that he talks about, and they had their conference, and there's a video of both Barack Obama and then Donald Trump talking in what I presume is Mandarin with perfect lip sync. So, you think about facial recognition and biometric security, you think about voice security. Suddenly there's lots of keys to backdoor a lot of this stuff. It's quite interesting.
Maybe the first time, I don't know, like definitely for the first time in like the image and voice generation space, as a human, it's very hard to tell, right? Like if you got shown an image that was generated by one of these networks, if you didn't know the context, you wouldn't necessarily guess that it was generated, right? Like it can fool us.
Well, this changes the web when we think of some of the sort of scandals of bots, whether it's dating networks, the bots that are on Tinder, those kind of things. Like, suddenly we're needing to create a generation of people who need a robotic assistant to decide if the person they're trying to swipe left is a fake or not.
I mean, just generally authenticity on the web now is such a challenging space. I mean, do you see this in terms of? I imagine a lot of communications into Zendesk and tickets would be, email based, for example. Yeah. So, do you have to deal with kind of fraud, potentially fraudulent email?
We definitely, and we have a whole team that is really interested in what fraudulent email looks like, and how people might want to try and use Zendesk in a fraudulent manner. Yeah. Spam detection, for example, is just a constant, this real life adversarial game, right? Like you update your models to detect spam, and the people who are trying to send spam work out ways around that, and then you've got to update your models again, and they've got to update theirs, and you go backwards and forwards, and that's why you can't just send emails with Viagra and capitals anymore, because that just goes straight to spam. You need to think of something slightly more creative.
And I think we saw the examples on this around those adversarial attacks where you can change a single pixel in an image which none of us could see with the naked eye, but that could then influence a machine to do something different. And I think the example given was an autonomous vehicle that now thinks a stop sign is a go sign.
Yeah. I think that's a really interesting thing. And I think Ian Goodfellow, who's also the person behind GANs, was sort of the first person, as far as I'm aware, to sort of to note this, right? But I think we train these machine learning models for facial recognition or whatever, right? And we assume because they do well on the data sets that we have in predicting, who that person is or what, types of things are in a scene, that they've learnt a model of the world that is similar to ours, right? Where we can see a TV anywhere and we know that it's a TV. But actually in the background, they may not be thinking about it like that, right? And it means that they can be quite open to small perturbations, like small changes in pixels where all of a sudden it kind of goes off the rails and doesn't think it's a TV anymore because you've changed 2 pixels. It now thinks it's a baboon. And you can imagine all the sorts of, particularly for self-driving cars, like the implications of maybe all of a sudden thinking that, a person crossing the road is, I don't know, like a stream of light or something because the sun's shining from a particular angle and ignoring it, right?
It's that whole new generation of cyber security kind of risks that suddenly go from our online world into our online world into our physical world as well.
Yeah, I think hacking self-driving cars in the real world is going to be quite interesting. Like just things like, what sort of small modifications would you have to make to a stop sign to make it not think that it's a stop sign anymore? Like you put a square sticker in the middle or something. Like a human's pretty good at being, even if it couldn't see the sign, they're like, well, there's a sign there. There's probably something I should maybe be a bit cautious, right?
And you think about a world in maybe, what do we think, maybe 10 years, let's say 10 years arguably, where there's a significant number of autonomous vehicles on the road.
Yeah.
You'd hazard a guess that the bulk of those would be manufactured by one company or a couple of companies. Let's say it's Google and through Waymo and maybe Uber, for example. Mm-hmm. So if you can do something that can influence those vehicles, you only need to really impact 2 manufacturers, and potentially you're causing millions of deaths.
Yeah.
Just putting, as an example.
I think scale is one of the things I talk a lot to ordinary people about the world of AI, but they get vastly down to the science fiction view that we're going to have robots doing things. But one of the challenges in the real estate industry is we don't have great extensive data sets. I think that's one of the things I would love to be at Zendesk for, is like you have got a data set within a focused area across 130,000 customers.
Yeah.
They've all got computers, so they're all breaking all the time. I'm jealous of that. That's amazing. And so I learned in the process of explaining scale in the talk I'm doing on the road at the moment, how many kilometres a day Waymo cars drive in self-driving mode. So this is today's pop quiz for the listeners, or the 2 experts in the room. Are you up with the scale of their experiments here?
I would struggle. I
mean, how many kilometres a day you reckon does the Waymo fleet do?
How big's their fleet? I don't even
know.
I'm
not giving you any clues. Good data science approach, asking for the facts, though.
I'm going to go with 1 million.
Too many. No, it's 40,000 a day. 40,000 kilometres a day. That is a lot of learning. And I think that's why we're going to be surprised at the acceleration of some of these technologies.
And the contrast between Waymo and Tesla is very interesting because, of course, Waymo have gone down the path of far more advanced LiDAR kind of technologies, whereas Tesla have put in their existing fleet much lower cost technology. And, of course, they're then benefiting from scale even more because if you look at how many kilometres are driven a day by Teslas on the road, it's significantly more than Waymo can do in their experiment field. So I think that's going to be the really interesting autonomous vehicle battle. It seems like it's going to be Waymo and Tesla rather than Waymo potentially and Uber.
Yeah. And I don't know exactly how Waymo tests, but Teslas are sort of around the world now as well, right? So they're not just getting data from cars driving in California or in Mountain View or something like that, but they're getting cars driving on the road all over the place. And I think that's like, training data is everything with machine learning, right? And that's where bias comes into it from from the ethics perspective, but also, where robustness to unseen situations comes. And the more varied training data you have, the better.
And the classic example with this one was, I think Toby Walsh put it in his book as well, but the Volvo autonomous vehicle that was tested here in Australia that couldn't recognise kangaroos. Yeah. And it was very good at detecting moose. I don't know what the plural of moose is. Is that mooses? Yeah. Moose? Anyway, those large animals that look, those kind of really big reindeer-looking things. Yeah. But its entire kind of animal recognition system was trained on animals that always have at least one leg or contact with the ground at all times. And as soon as the kangaroo left the ground, it kind of lost it. And it's kind of an interesting example of localization. And you need to train for that, right? I feel like we need to ask the sci-fi question.
I'm very up for that. So welcome to the club of people who've had to explain which of the following views of a future world might be true. Now, it does rely on a little bit of sci-fi movie knowledge from you. May not be a movie, but some of these so let's run through them. Let's just imagine in the year 2050 or 2062, in Toby's view. Yeah. Does the world look the most like the Jetsons? Which was set in 2062, by the way. Lovely fact. We'll go Star Trek. Mm-hmm. So, a world where AI is embedded in everything we do. Is it the Terminator, Wall-E, Blade Runner, Altered Carbon, or Her? Now, it's going to be a stinker if you're not up with pop culture.
I don't know. I mean, Star Trek feels like, and I don't think I've ever actually seen a whole Star Trek movie, but I do have a relatively good understanding of what goes on in Star Trek. It seems like the least dystopian out of them, outside of maybe the Jetsons. I think Star Trek would be all right. I would hope that, that it's AI everywhere, but in, helping and supporting us in, making our lives better.
So you know an awful lot. Are you optimistic or dystopian about this world that you are giving birth to with your skills and knowledge and processes?
I'd say I'm optimistic.
And I have to ask why.
In some respects, I think of AI and ML just like any other technology we've ever developed, and we've developed a crap ton of technologies that could blow us all apart at any given time, and we've managed to not do that so far. So I'm not entirely sure that it's going to be any worse than that, I think. I would say I'm an AI general skeptic. I'm not sure whether we will ever reach the real general intelligence, like the singularity. And I think a lot of the fear that people spin comes out of that. It's also an interesting thing, I think, that, if we're going to reach a singularity, we're probably not going to have a whole lot of input into whether we're going to get there or not anyway, so maybe it's not worth worrying about. I'm not sure. I think there's a lot more pressing problems now around the fairness of the sort of the machine learning models that are in our world right now to worry about than something that may or may not happen quite far in the future.
Yeah, I love the sort of ironic circularity of, the lawyers being put out of jobs because a law bot can, chat with someone and make a will. A bot can review all the documents in a massive court case. And the fact that the court case of the week is someone taking the robo-debt case to court as being an unfair algorithm and being managed in an incredibly unethical way. So wonderful that a bot made more jobs for lawyers.
And so I think there's definitely that trend where the more people you talk to who are closer to the technology out there today are generally more skeptical, I think, about artificial general intelligence. And what do you see as the big kind of breakthrough that comes next? And if it's not artificial general intelligence, but what are the kind of breakthroughs that you're thinking about, you're seeing in the industry?
Computer vision and image detection and image generation has seen huge gains in the last few years. I think natural language processing, dealing with text in the same sort of way, has seen gains, but I don't think it's gotten as far as it's going to get. And I think where that field is just picking up steam now. The application of all these technologies to text, and it's different to images, and it's taking us a while to sort of adapt some of those techniques or come up with new techniques that work for that. But I think that's really accelerating. And, I think the space of maybe conversational bots they're not very good at the moment, or at least generative conversational bots are not very good. You can build a pretty compelling rules-based bot, but like Tay's a perfect example of why just having a generalized generating text bot out in the world is not necessarily a good thing at the moment, but I think there's a lot of progress happening in that field, and I think that's gonna change.
And we had Professor Tim Miller on, and he talked about this a bit and said that a lot of the algorithms that underpin the products we're seeing today and underpin deep learning have been around since, was it the 1980s or 90s? I think it was actually earlier, wasn't it? 1960s. And was it recurrent neural networks? I think he said were.
Yeah. That was like the back propagation side of things. I think like the idea of like neurons as computing elements is from sort of the 50s in like early neuroscience and computational research. So the building blocks have been there for quite a while. I think we're seeing more data, more compute, and more more ability to put those things together. Plus, we've learned a bunch of other stuff.
And that's really interesting because Kai-Fu Lee, the book Nigel recommended to me, AI Superpowers, talks about how we're shifting from the age of discovery to the age of application, and that it's more about entrepreneurs and businesses that can take what's already been built and apply it at scale. In your field, but obviously natural language processing is a big one for Zendesk. Do you think that there'll be big breakthroughs? Do you think that kind of research is still happening? Or
the research is definitely happening. I think also, like if you think about building product out of that stuff, the research is probably the area that's getting commoditized the fastest. The algorithms, you look at things like TensorFlow, and all of the pre-trained or pre-built types of models that you can get with that. So that's moving super quickly. But I don't think it's necessarily the differentiator for a company in that space.
So that kind of enables a lift of lots of companies to a certain level.
Yeah.
So, and then where do you think the research, or where will the research come from and who do you think will capitalize on that to step ahead of the crowd then?
That's a tricky one. Definitely companies with data is that, I think if you think about like product that people are going to engage with that is built on these sort of techniques, I think the way to get ahead with that is to have the better data sets and to have the tighter product integration. You can have an amazing algorithm, but if you don't have a compelling way for people to interact with it in a way that, that they want to actually have that interaction, it's not really worth much in a business setting, I think.
Yeah, okay.
Part of my optimism comes from some of the things I've discovered in looking into this field recently and travelling around Australia. I need a big kind of sugar hit for every place I visit. So I was in Brisbane this week and consequently discovered the University of Queensland's algorithms that they've built around melanoma detection. Yeah. Then we're talking 97% accuracy of diagnosis and so fast. So that's just brilliant to me. That is such a big health leap for us. It gives doctors more time to spend doing the humane things and psyching themselves up to deliver the bad news or whatever it is. That makes me very optimistic. And I think the same on your field of text interpretation to become more humane. I occasionally, we'll mention another brand, I occasionally get something back from Salesforce's Genius, Edison, or who, I'm not sure who they named theirs after. Einstein's, right? Very abrupt and, triggers my humanity and my emotions. And I don't feel, no, I'm not going to do that because you're just rude.
Yeah, it's a really interesting... I think like the space of like user experience UX design around how people interact with machine learning is nascent and it's going to be hugely influential, right? Like how do people actually want to interact with a bot? Because you can make it work in a way that people are comfortable with understanding like this is a bot and I recognize that and therefore I'm going to have different expectations compared to if I think it's a bot posing as a human or some other style of interaction. Yeah, it's definitely something that we've sort of learnt a lot about over the last few years, and I think it's something that's going to continue to evolve a lot.
Does Zendesk call it out, that it, like Google does with the assistant, you call it out that this is a bot-generated reply?
Yeah, we're very specific about that. I think we decided very early on that, that we didn't want to pretend to be a human. That's probably not going to be a good experience for anyone involved, and we've stuck with that, yeah.
So you're close to a very advanced business, and, you're riding this wave really fast. There's a lot of Australian businesses just getting started in this field. Have you got a piece of wisdom, for a board of directors going, we've read all about this stuff in Time magazine. Do we need an AI strategy? What do you think? What would be your piece of advice for those executives and that board to think about for their business?
Yeah, I think the key thing is to look for areas where you think you actually need it, because I would argue most problems don't need AI behind them, but there are definitely some places where you can get huge impacts from it. And, I think the thought process we go through is sort of, look for a part of the business that we want to impact or influence. What is our goal in influencing that? How would we measure it? And then what's the dumbest way that we could start impacting that, right? Is there a heuristic? Is it an if-then-else statement? Is it a decision tree or something like that, right? And often you can push down that path quite far, and maybe you get far enough that you're sort of like, well, this problem is not pressing anymore. Now we need to go look somewhere else. But sometimes you get into the point where you're, like I think Answerbot's a really good example, like interpreting someone's whole email, which is sounds quite similar to a search query, but is quite different because search queries are very specific. You can keyword match these sort of things, whereas the way people write emails are quite long. They've got salutations, they've got superfluous information, all of this sort of stuff. You start digging into that and it can become very clear that if that's your goal and the thing you want to influence, there is some gap where you're going to have to build some smarts. And I think once if you approach it like that and you can really identify these places where you can't get far enough with everything else you've tried, that's probably pretty ripe for at least starting.
You raise an interesting point, and you might be working on this, but I'd love Answerbot to detect my emotional state. So you can tell I'm really stressed because I haven't been able to log into this thing, and then maybe there's something in my text or the way I've typed or otherwise, and then come back and be a bit more empathetic with me today.
Yeah. I think it's a really interesting thing that we noticed going into like satisfaction prediction. This idea of predicting whether you're having a good or bad customer experience is that in support use cases, sentiment isn't necessarily a good indicator of how it's going to turn out because a lot of people are frustrated and a lot of people have negative sentiment even if they're getting a good support experience, and that it can take quite a while to turn that around. So it's not necessarily a terrible indicator. Being empathetic out of the gate is probably always a good thing, I would think.
It's going back to your point around University of Queensland and that incredible performance of melanoma detection. And unfortunately, a lot of times the dialogue around that will be job loss of radiologists rather than you think about combining that accuracy with incredible natural language processing and the ability for a radiologist to talk to a machine to understand that diagnosis, in real time, to be able to present a way better outcome to the patient.
Totally, because I can't imagine a future where maybe it sounds dystopian to me, where you go into a booth and you put your arm out and it scans, it says you've got melanoma, and you're like, great. But what happens now? I need like a treatment plan. I want to have like a doctor to consult with. All of these sort of different things. Like I don't think it replaces a doctor. I think it helps the doctor to give better, more consistent diagnoses.
And then to link back to your point about your advice for business, I think it's a scale question as well. Yeah. So the other fascinating example I found was a Chinese one working on detection of cancer, breast cancer in particular. Now, they've got a scale issue with 1.2 billion people and trying to build a hospital system and timing is everything with breast cancer. So they've trained this thing on data sets and its performance is remarkable, really complex lesions. And this thing's get about 87% accuracy and saved 30% of unnecessary surgeries.
Yeah, amazing.
And its record so far is 255 correct diagnoses in 15 minutes. Now, that gives me great optimism for an AI-driven future.
Yeah, and I think scale is like the place where you can impact as well, right? You can save 5 seconds on a particular task here. It doesn't sound like much if you do it once a week, but if you're doing it 1 million times a day, that can be really important.
And coming back to the topic around advice that you'd give, I mean, one of the things I hear from organisations is we want to go down this path, but it's too hard to find the skills that we need. And obviously, Zendesk has got a pretty good value proposition to attract those kind of people. Yeah. If you're getting started, what do you think are the first couple of roles that you need to fill on your team to actually get started? Because you don't need to go and hire 10 PhDs, I'm assuming. But
and I'm kind of going through that thinking at the moment as well, because I think for us hiring into new locations like San Francisco and Copenhagen is kind of the same thing, right? We do have an established team here, but effectively, particularly if you're in Copenhagen, we're going to be asleep when you're awake. So most of the time, these people are going to be working with that particular product development team, by themselves. And I think particularly for the first hire, I think the thing you want to look for is definitely someone who is self-sufficient. I think they need to be able to do all of the things. They need to be able to unblock themselves, like do the coding, do the research, come up with the hypotheses, all of this sort of stuff, and effectively be, it's probably the hardest hire because you want someone who is a competent data scientist who you think can also grow into a leadership position in that place and grow a team around them, right? Even if that's maybe not a skill set that they necessarily have yet.
And how important do you think domain knowledge is for a data scientist?
I think domain knowledge is extremely important, but I think it's also something you learn on the job, right? Like I would say I generally have domain knowledge in tech. It doesn't mean I'm going to be very good, right now at diagnosing a problem that REA has, right? Versus, a problem that Seek has versus a problem that we have. I think people who definitely need to be open to going into the business and understanding it and learning it, but people may not necessarily align with that with their experience previously. And I think that's not what you're hiring them for anyway. Hopefully they're good, curious problem solver type people who are happy to go and learn any space that you throw them at.
We've got to throw our other big question.
Oh, yes. And the deadline has passed on this one, of course. So we've been fascinated because the sort of people we've had on the show are they're subject matter experts, so they should be close to the subjects of data security, ethics, and all those kind of things. So the killer question is the Australian public, the health record system.
I come from a neuroscience research background. I come from a background where data is super important, and I can understand all of those perspectives of how amazing it would be to have all of this information and be able to understand all of those patterns. But I don't know.
We're worried about
trust isn't there.
For me, it was the third-party access and realising what could happen to this data. I suppose Cambridge Analytica educated everyone last year as to what can happen when your data escapes and somebody untoward gets hold of it and reapplies it in a way you weren't expecting.
Was it in Iceland? I think there was like a project before Iceland went bankrupt, basically, as a country. There was a project where they were mapping the genetics of everyone in Iceland because I think they have quite an insular population, and it was very interesting to go and see. I think it's easier to find like how variations than in the genome sort of map to particular health issues and that sort of thing. But the company that was running it, I believe, when Iceland went bankrupt, took the data set and went to the US. And you're like, okay, cool. So that's like just the genome of everybody in this country. Great.
And in the world's smallest example of the same thing, I'm not sure if you saw the news from Bunnings yesterday, that our wonderful hardware people, where an over-enthusiastic employee with a penchant for statistics took home the Bunnings branch's staff list, their performance reviews, and a large amount of customer ID stuff to correlate to their performance, and then popped it on a public server. So undoing that one at the moment, look, it can happen. So simply with great intent and just didn't think through that, popping that on a public server. Now, they were quoting the name of a bot that goes around and starts looking for this kind of thing that someone's written.
Yeah.
And that scared me going,
amazing.
It's like a credentials bot that is able to recognize the patterns of credit card numbers and things like so. All right, it's time to retreat to that vineyard in New Zealand and go back to fire and farming.
On the topic of governments here and regulation as well, obviously we had the Australian government before Christmas make this change around encryption laws. As a tech business based here in Australia, does that impact Zendesk? I mean, does that then mean that you have to effectively give someone the keys if they ask for it in the government? Has that come through to you yet?
It's definitely something that our legal department has been reviewing. And I saw a thing in the paper today saying that they've already used it, apparently, since it got passed in December. They didn't say what on, but it's been done. So.
Because obviously there's a huge amount of dialogue now. For a lot of startups are saying this is going to kill us in the market. If we go and pitch internationally, as an Australian company, we're effectively almost ruled out the process at the first stage.
It does seem to align. I think, and my knowledge on this is not great. With like the Patriot Act in the US has like a similar sort of thing where people can be compelled to do. Well, who knows what? Every so often there's like reporting on the number of times people have been compelled to do stuff, but you don't know what it is. The tech companies in the US still seem to be doing all right, but it doesn't feel like a great piece of legislation to me, and I don't really buy the idea of we can have secure encrypted systems, but there's a backdoor. I think it's pretty binary. It's one or the other. It can't be both.
It's kind of, I think someone gave the analogy the other day of saying, well, it's kind of like giving the police a key for every house in the country just in case they need it. Do you think that's a good idea? It's an interesting way of looking at it.
Yes.
Well, Chris, I think we're about out of time. So thank you so much for joining us. It's been fantastic talking to you, and we very much appreciate making the time available.
Thanks for having me. This has been fun.
And best of luck with your team in this year at Zendesk, building that up and going international. That's super exciting.
Cheers. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us on AI Australia. We hope you got a lot out of it. If you enjoyed the show, feel free to leave us a review on iTunes by searching for AI Australia and giving us your honest feedback. It goes a long way to boost our visibility when you do that, so we really appreciate it. As always, we'd love to hear from you. To get in touch, head to eliiza.com.au/contact and drop us a note. Thanks again, and look forward to seeing you next week.